studies with the Sermon on the Mount, and we now come to the very last section of the whole very important lesson that Jesus has taught. He taught us a lot of wonderful, important principles, and now Jesus has come to this part of his sermon, Matthew 7:24-25, and this is a very common passage that we are very familiar with, and even kids in Sunday school sing this song as well, isn't it? Today I'll be focusing on the first two verses about, wise men building house on the rock. So, and it's important to note that as Jesus concludes his sermon, it's really more of, okay, you have listened a lot to what he has said, and now what is the main message, isn't it? And the main message is, comparing the wise builder and the foolish builder. What's the difference? The difference is that both have listened, but only one actually did what Christ has done. And for those that did what Christ has done, it's like a hymn to a wise builder building the house on the rock. So before we even begin to kind of go a bit in depth with these first two verses, just a few things in mind that we need to bear in mind. What are some important messages that you take home even before going into the details? The first message is Jesus expects his believers to do. Because if you look in the parallel passage in Luke chapter 6, especially in verse 46, it states, "But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say?" So yes, it's important to listen to the teachings of Christ. It's important to listen to lessons, from the Bible, during Bible class, sermon. It's absolutely important to listen. But what do we need to do? Jesus actually expects us to actually do as well. And that's the big difference between the wise builder and the foolish builder. And not only that, and I was studying for this lesson this morning, so another thing we need to really bear in mind is that we need to expect to be tested. But why? If you look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 25 and verse 27, the Bible states, "And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house." And look at both verses, exactly the same conditions that were made on that house. Whether is it a house that was built on the rock or on the sand, it's the same condition. And we do know, if we look about rains, floods, and winds, are generally times in which it's challenging, isn't it? And it will challenge, how stable the house is. And we know, depending on the foundation, a very, very different outcome. So the message this morning, you need to bear in mind is you need to build on the strong and correct foundation. Because probably Uncle Han might know better than me as a structural engineer. So as foundation is the most crucial part of the building, isn't it? Because why? With foundation, it actually distributes the weight of the building and ensures that the building it stands strong with the elements that is being experienced under. So of course, we do know this very famous tower structure, Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? So we do know that from history, it was actually built, first of all, in August 1173, when the foundation was first laid. And I think after about 6 years or so, when they began to build the second floor, it started to lean one side. That's why it became now the famous Leaning Tower, isn't it? So according to engineers and historians, the biggest issue and reason why the tower started to lean was because it was only built with just 3 meters of foundation set in weak, unstable soil. I'm not a structural engineer, I don't know how deep it should be, but imagine building a structure, a very big building on just sandy ground. Can imagine how weak that is. And that's the reason why it started to tilt. And according to once they want to actually stabilize this building, so in 1990, they actually started to add counterweights to try to balance it back again, so it doesn't tilt too far before it actually collapses. So they actually even closed the tower. And what happened was they actually tried to stabilize the building. So according to research, what they did was they first attached cable to make it strong so that it doesn't fall, started to dig underneath one side so that to extract the soil so that it kind of balances off again. And from what I understand as well is that because the water table on one side is different from another, so during different seasons, the tower tilts more to one side. So they actually even extract out the water and drain the water so that the ground is more stable despite the seasons. So they did a lot of work to stabilize the building to the point that I think in 2001, they managed to actually bring it back to about 4 degrees inclination. So they managed to make it more stable for apparently next 200 years. That's what they claim anyway. So of course they're not going to make it straight because it kind of loses its charm, isn't it? But that's not the point. So the point is, from this very real life example that we see, if buildings are not built on strong, stable foundation, as we see in this very clear example, if we leave it alone, what happens? It's actually going to tilt, and then fall eventually, isn't it? And that's what they did to preserve this building. So now, coming back to our spiritual life, it's so important that we need to have this application to our spiritual life. Because now we look in Luke chapter 6, verse 48, a parallel verse. The Bible states, "He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the floods arose, the stream beat vehemently against the house and could not shake it, was founded on the rock." So for enable to us to build a strong foundation, what the Bible actually described this man, he dig very deep to the point at which actually solid rock before he built the foundation for the house. And by doing so, we know that the house actually stood strong. So we know, spiritually speaking, Christ is our foundation, as we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. So today, as we continue kind of understanding what this foundation you need to have, I'll take examples from the life of Daniel in the book of Daniel, also picking up some lessons we learned from the Sermon on the Mount, and also giving credit to the writer who wrote the same article for the spiritual sword lectureship in 1982. His name is Leon Cole. He wrote this article. I took some of his points and combined everything together to share what are some of the foundations that you need to have in order to wisely build our house on our house. So if I may suggest, the first foundation is purpose. And we know this common saying is that a man without a purpose is like a ship without a rudder. So it's impossible to steer a ship without a rudder in a storm. So similarly to us, any mankind, if there's no purpose, it's kind of, why are we even living in this earth, isn't it? Do whatever we want to do, but in the end, kind of goes to nowhere. So now making an example of Daniel itself, you turn with me to Daniel chapter 1. I will just give a summary and of course some of the key messages from there. But right at the beginning from Daniel chapter 1, just based on the context of this story was that King of Babylon actually besieged Jerusalem and took captives away from Jerusalem. And some of them were actually taken to serve in the king's palace. So the whole idea was, they wanted to train the captives to know the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And after 3 years of their training, then they will serve in the palace. That was the context of this Daniel chapter 1. But now look specifically in verse 8. The Bible states, Daniel purposed in his heart. And it's something that we need to bear in mind. And putting yourself in Daniel's shoe. Imagine you're captive by a stronger nation, right? You have no rights. You just have to follow the rules of the land. And on that, you're actually kind of brought away from your countrymen, brought to somewhere else in a foreign country, and you're being made to serve and prepare to serve in the king's palace. So if you're in that situation, what will you think you do? Will you still hold on to your Jewish tradition, or will you potentially tend to cave into, so that I can be well looked after, so that I won't get suffer under this ruler? Would I then adjust your own practices? But Daniel did not. And actually purpose in his heart. And despite whatever he has to do, he will not forsake God. And that's what he did. So that's something that you have to bear in mind. Learning from the example of Daniel, actually purpose in his heart. And we know purpose, if we have the determination, can do anything. So now looking at an example also from the Sermon on the Mount and recapping of what we have learned and how it's related to this point. We're reminded in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 to 16, how we are salt of the earth and light of the world. And we do know salt and light have to serve their purpose. If not, they are useless. Not only that, chapter 6, verse 19 to 21, we're reminded to lay up our treasures in heaven. In verse 24, we're reminded to serve God and not mammon. Of course, we're referring to material blessings. And of course, the very famous verse 33, to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. So Christ has given us throughout his sermon what is the purpose of mankind essentially. Really have to really seek God first. And looking at other scriptures in the Bible, and we are so familiar with Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13, and what is man's duty, isn't it? But as I was studying through this lesson, the writer actually give this very interesting passage to actually bear in mind about the purpose of our life, especially as a Christian. So instead of quoting Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13, which I'm familiar with, the writer actually quotes Romans chapter 1 verse 14. What is Paul about Paul being a debtor, isn't it? And it's kind of giving us a very different perspective of things. When you say, I am a debtor, what does it mean? That you owe something, don't you? It's like when you have a mortgage, you have to pay your monthly installments. If not, you're in big trouble. You have to pay more interest, and if you don't pay interest, then you might get the debt collector coming after you, and there's a lot of pain about that. So we know it's so important to pay our debts, isn't it? But it really gives us that idea, that spiritually speaking, we have sin. That is a fact, isn't it? Regardless of how best we try to live our lives, we will sin. And because if we sin according to the law, we will be punished. And in God's right, you have every right to punish us immediately. Tell you how, you break the law, you're speeding, you're caught, and you have to serve your punishment. That is the expectation of breaking the law. So similarly, as we sin, we break God's law. So God has every right to punish us if He wants to immediately. But yet we know God is so gracious to us, isn't it? That even despite us even knowing Him even in the first place, right at the time when Christ came, when we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God actually made and went beyond what He needed to do to send Christ to save us. You can just let us be punished, and and that's it. You can have done that. But because God loved us so much, that He actually gave us not only time, but also a way home, salvation. And it's something that even I'm also trying my very best to comprehend, because if we break the law, we say, okay, it's expected to be punished. But yet God loved us so much that if we actually obey Him, we can escape that punishment. And that's how much God love has for us. And and that's why coming back to this phrase, I am a debtor. I owe God everything. And that's how we should keep that purpose in mind. And that will probably even drive us, okay, there's more that we need to do. So hence, we need to purposefully build our life upon the sayings of Christ. And that's the first foundation that we need to lay. We need to purpose our life according to Christ's words. Second foundation will be purity. And going back to the same passage in Daniel chapter 1 verse 8, we know that Daniel purposed in his heart that he will not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So doing a bit of research, we know that the food that is served as part of the king's delicacy will most likely obtain or contain food that will go against the Old Testament law. Because you go into Leviticus chapter 11, there's a lot of rules about eating, or what is clean and unclean, isn't it? So most likely the food that's being served are unclean according to God's law at the time. And also there are many other reasons why the food might be defiled or unclean in that time. So what did Daniel do? He keep purpose that he will not defile himself. He will not actually eat the good food, isn't it? That is what it is. But he knowing that if he did that, he will actually break God's law. So actually, we want to maintain purity. And coming back to, of course, we might not appreciate that much because now we can eat everything, anything. That doesn't matter to us right now. But looking at how we need to maintain good food standards, isn't it? If you eat food that's a bit off, a bit spoiled, you might suffer some consequences. Might have diarrhea, might have, even more worse conditions. And the reason why, even for babies and toddlers, it's so important that the food has to be thoroughly cooked and the water has to be boiled so that the baby doesn't get sick. So, it's so important about, keeping food safe and clean and pure. And I just kind of stumbled across this article back in recently, October 30th. There was a warning issued by the Victorian coroner because an elderly woman died in May for eating a wild mushroom growing in her backyard. And we do know, according to, I think the research was that she actually ate the death cat mushroom. So, and that's the reason why she died. So even though, it looks like white mushroom, isn't it? You can just eat and just serve. Oh, it looks nice. But of course, that was actually a very poisonous mushroom that led to her death. So using that example of how eating contaminated food might harm us physically speaking, what more? How are we feeding our spiritual soul? Are we feeding pure food, or are we contaminating because of what we do? And now reflecting now on the Sermon on the Mount, which we studied for many weeks, we're reminded in many, many things. First of all, in chapter 5, verse 8, reminded that blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Important. In order to be able to see God and know God, we need to be pure. Not only that, in verse 21 to verse 26, reminded that not to be angry without a good cause. And of course, in the next few verses, 27 to 30, for those who are married, need to refrain from adultery. And this adultery is not just a physical act, it goes even beyond that, even to the heart. When even look and lust after a woman, you already committed adultery. So even the intention, the thoughts, has to be pure as well. And in chapter 6, verse 1 to 4, reminded that there's a correct way to do charitable deeds, not just to flaunt and say, I'm doing very good, but you need to do it in the correct manner. And of course, in verse 16 to verse 18, also reminded of how to fast correctly, not to say, oh, I fasted and I look very horrible, but more of, to fast in secret, and then God will reward us openly. And of course, in chapter 7, verse 1 to 6, reminded of, we need to judge ourselves first before actually help others improve themselves as well. So all of this really kind of brings to mind, we need to have a pure life in the mind of Christ. And reminded in James chapter 1, verse 27, pure and undefiled religion before God is this, is to visit the orphan and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. It's such a good summary of what we need to do as Christians. We need to have a pure and undefiled religion. And that means to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So we need to be pure to build our life upon the sayings of Christ. And that's the second foundation we need to have. The third foundation is we need to be philanthropic. And now, kind of, before I even go to the example of Daniel, the writer that I took some examples from, he gives the example of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea in Israel. And what's the difference between these two seas? Sea of Galilee actually feeds into the Dead Sea. And we know if you look at, the area, it actually supports life in that region. But you look at the Dead Sea, it's actually a one-way street where all the water actually accumulates and it stops there. And because of that, salt content is so high that it can actually have no life at all. And when I was there, when I visited Israel, the salt content is so high that it can actually float on the water. It's actually true. So it's physics. But anyway, the point is that the Sea of Galilee gives and generously gives life, isn't it? But the Dead Sea just takes and does not give. And what happens? Because the Dead Sea just takes and accumulates all the salt, no life could be in that sea. So it kind of gives us a different perspective, isn't it? That, the more we give, the more it's actually more abundant we can actually do good works. But the more we take, what happens? It just kind of die and shrivel down, isn't it? So now looking at an example of Daniel itself, and now you turn me to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, and this was after Daniel actually interpreted the king's dream of the statue. And now because of his interpretation, he made able to give to the king. We know in verse 48 itself, we just read that verse. Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, it says, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So because of how the king was so impressed by Daniel's ability to interpret dreams, Daniel was rewarded. So yes, good on Daniel, isn't it? But Daniel did not forget also about his friends. Now look now in the next verse, in verse 49, it says, also Daniel petitioned the king, and it said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So know that even though Daniel was promoted to be a privileged position, he did not forget about his friends that were with him. And because of his petition, they were also kind of exalted as well. So no, Daniel did not forget about his friends. And now coming to the Sermon on the Mount itself, we know in chapter 5, verse 38 to 42, we are reminded to go the second mile. And we need to give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. And that's kind of what a Christian should be, isn't it? Because reminded also in Matthew chapter 10, verse 18, that freely you have received, freely give. And the word is in the context of how the apostles were given gifts, and they have to freely use the gift for the benefit of God's work. But broadly, as a Christian, whatever we have all comes from God, isn't it? We're supposed to be stewards of what God has blessed us with. And of course, the passage that we're familiar with, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 to 9, talking about, those who sow bountifully will reap bountifully. And if we look now in verse 8 itself, let's turn to that. 2 Corinthians and the Lord is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. And this is something that only Christians have that promise, because if you think of it in a logical sense, how can I have more when I give away, isn't it? When I give away $100 means I have $100 less. That is the worst thinking, isn't it? But from God's perspective, if we actually give more, we actually allow God's grace to work in us. That in the sense of, because we're doing for God, we're doing and giving and doing and supporting good work. Then what the Bible, God actually promised that we have all sufficiency, all things. So first of all, we're sufficient for our own day-to-day living. But not only that, it was in verse 8, the second half, it says, abundance for every good work. So in God's promise, the more we do good, the more we give, the more we receive, and more we're able to give as well. So that is God's promise to us. So we need to actually be philanthropically build our life upon the sayings of Christ. And that's the third foundation you need to remember. They need to really be generous. Next foundation you need to have is piety or faithfulness. We know that Daniel was a faithful person. Because now if you turn with me to Daniel chapter 6 itself, this is a context where now we have a new king called King Darius. And then Daniel was promoted to be one of the governors of one of the lands as well. And we can know in Daniel chapter 6, we will read verse Spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So Daniel was doing such a good job that that the king was saying, oh, shall I give me control over the whole land? And because of this, what happened? We now read in verse 4 itself. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful. Now, was there any error or fault found in him? So that despite the exalted position that Daniel had, he was still very faithfully discharging his duty to the kingdom. To the point, where other people got jealous of his position or what he's doing, to the point they want to find some fault. Oh, there must be something that I can find that, to make him lose favor from the king. But they could not find fault, because why? He was faithful. So it's something that we can learn from Daniel. And now coming to the Sermon on the Mount as well, reminded in chapter 5, verse 20, we need to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And we know that, the scribes and Pharisees are supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the people. They're supposed to know God's law, supposed to teach God's law. But what happened? They corrupted it to the point where they're just teaching man's tradition. They appear to be very righteous in the eyes of men, but their heart, we know, is often not right to the point, where Jesus, condemned and saying they are hypocrites, isn't it? So in order to, be really faithful to God, we actually need to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And of course, we know in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25 to verse 34, reminded to seek after the kingdom of God, to have faith. And other scriptures in the Bible remind by sight. And so Hebrews 11 verse 6, but without faith, it is impossible to please him. So we really need to have faith. And that is probably the key thing that we need to have. And the writer actually suggested what our faith should be like. So it suggested that our faith should be an intelligent faith, a faith that is firm and grounded in the word. So it needs to be a practical faith where we learn from the examples of the many things in the Bible, from the people that we read of, and to then display in our lives. But we need to have the patience of Job, the endurance of Paul, the devotion of Ruth, sacrifice of Stephen, and any other good examples you can think of. We need to live this practically in our life. And their faith is practical. And another thing that our faith should be, that our faith needs to be a personal faith. That we need to have true conviction of our faith. It's not based off of because I grew up in the church and I kind of just go along with the flow. But you really need to have that true understanding and a true belief that this Bible that we have read so much about God and about Christ, and all good examples, is so important that I really want to serve God. Not because it's convenient, not because it's familiar to me, but despite whatever, we need to continue to be faithful to God. So we need to piously build our life upon the sayings of Christ. And that's the fourth foundation. The fifth foundation would be perseverance. And we are familiar with this part of Daniel's life in Daniel chapter 6, about Daniel and the lion's den. But if we now turn with me to verse 7 itself, to Daniel chapter 6, verse 7. And this after the governors tried to find fault, and then they couldn't find fault. And what they had a plan to then ask the king to set a decree. So in verse 7 it states, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors had consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree. They will petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So they wanted now to trap Daniel, isn't it? And wanted him to fail and to be essentially killed by the lion. That's what their plan is. And one thing you need to know about the law of the Middle Persians is that once a king issues a decree, even the king himself cannot kind of relent the decree. So once it's out, it's out. The king can even say, no, I'm going to cancel that law. That doesn't work in that land. So the king was kind of foolish enough to set off the decree. But despite that, now we read in verse 10 about Daniel, how he reacted to it. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Bear in mind, Daniel knew full well the decree was written. But what happened? Did he say, oh, I will still pray to God, but let's just, hide and close the window and I can still pray. I'm still following God. I'm not disobeying God. But what did he do? He did not let the decree and the imminent threat to his life stop him from doing what he did all the time, which is to open the window, face Jerusalem, and pray 3 times a day. He was not afraid. Continued to persevere in his practice, in his devotion to God. And that's something that we can really learn from the perseverance of Daniel. Despite the life-threatening law, he still did what he did. And looking at the Sermon on the Mount itself, we are reminded in verse 43 to verse 48 to love your enemies. And it's such a challenging thing to do, isn't it? Because why? Our enemies are there to harm us. And as a natural form of defense, let us just stay away. Let us not kind of be too close to my enemies. If I don't harm my enemies, that's good enough. But God expects us to even love our enemies, to go even beyond just protecting ourselves, but to also love them. And that requires a lot of effort and perseverance on our part. And first, we're reminded in chapter 7, verse 13 to 14, that we need to enter the narrow gate. The gate that's difficult and straight. But what is the end destination? It leads to life. But the journey is tough. We need to persevere to even receive the reward. And of course, reminded in 2 Timothy verse 1 to 7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." And in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 13 it says, "Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong." So yes, even though we need to walk the difficult path, but what God has given us power, love, sound mind, so that we will not fear. And of course, we need to be brave and be strong. So we need to persevere in building our life upon the sayings of Christ. And the last foundation I'd like to suggest this morning, due to time, is that we need to have constant prayer. And as we know, Daniel showed the perfect example of constantly praying as well. And also, just slightly further after that, in actually chapter 9 itself, it's actually after, and still when Jerusalem was still in captivity, and it's probably the end few years before they actually prophesied to be free from captivity. But in chapter 9, verse 3, it says that, "Then I," with regards to Daniel, "set my face towards the Lord God to make requests by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes." So Daniel was still constantly praying for himself and for the people, to God to pardon them and to set them free. So we can learn from the example of Daniel. And from the Sermon on the Mount, we're reminded in chapter 6, verse 5 to 15, Jesus taught us how to pray, isn't it? The different things and the attitude that we need to have. And of course, in chapter 7, verse 7 to 8, the assurance that if we ask, we receive, we seek, we will find, we will knock, and the door shall be opened to us. And in Philippians 4, verse 6, we're reminded, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." So we know that prayer is such a privilege to every Christian. And it is probably a deal breaker on our faith, isn't it? Because with prayer, we can go to God. We can seek His help. We can have someone to talk to. And from the psychological perspective, it's so important as well. So we need to prayerfully build our life upon the sayings of Christ. And as we now conclude and summarize today's kind of sharing, we know that we need to build our faith, like how we need to build our house on good foundation. And just reflecting on the song that we just sang earlier, hymn 83, about home safe with Him at last, and how the choruses talk about having lightning's flash, thunder's roll, rough lashing waves, kind of brings to mind back to Matthew chapter 7, about how when we build our faith, our house, we need to expect to be tried, isn't it? Because we have rain of challenges, we have the flood of sufferings, and the winds of temptation that comes our way every day. And this will be a surety to anyone as we continue our faith. So what happens? We need to be wise to build our foundation, build our house on the correct foundation. And this foundation consists of having that correct purpose in our life. They need to have purity. We need to be philanthropic. We need to have piety. We need to persevere and have perseverance. And we need to be prayerful. And once we have all this foundation, we can then wisely build the house of one's lives. And it's all built upon the sayings of Christ, the source of truth, the anchor of our faith. And as we're about to sing the invitation hymn, Hark the Gentle Voice, a really kind of shout out to one and all here, especially to my fellow Christians. We know that our lives will be challenged, with rain and winds and the floods. But as what we'll sing shortly, that even though we are heavy laden and we labor a lot for God, what happened? Christ gave us word that He will give us rest. Yes, this life might be challenging if we live faithfully to God. But at the end of this, we there's no sight of that progress. And to those among us, both online and so here, about not Christian as well, life is difficult also. But as a Christian, we have a comfort and peace that goes beyond human wisdom.